Miss Marple and the entire dinner party poisoned the autumn evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with that peculiar golden quality that made even the most ordinary cottages appear touched by some benevolent enchantment. Miss Jane Marple, making her way along the high street with her knitting bag and a modest bouquet of dahlias from her garden, reflected that October was perhaps her favourite month, though she said the same about April, and indeed most of July. She was bound for Gossington Hall, the Georgian manor house that dominated the eastern edge of the village, where Mrs. Dolly Bantry had organised what she called a proper civilised dinner party. Jane, with none of this dreadful modern informality. There were to be 8 at table. Mrs. Bantry had explained over the telephone, a number she considered ideal for conversation without cacophony. As Miss Marple approached the gravelled drive, she observed Colonel Arthur Bantry standing in the doorway, checking his pocket watch with the anxious expression of a man who knew his wife's intolerance for tardiness. He brightened visibly at her approach. "Ah, Miss Marple. Punctual, as always. Do come in, come in. Dolly's been in quite a state all afternoon. New cook, you know, and she's determined everything should be absolutely perfect. Indeed." As Miss Marple surrendered her light coat to the maid, she could hear Mrs. Bantry's animated voice from the drawing-room, rising and falling with theatrical emphasis. The other guests had already assembled. Dr. James Haydock, the village physician, a sensible man with greying temples and steady hands. His wife Eleanor, a woman of pronounced opinions on nearly every subject. Mr. Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, who had motored down from London for the occasion. His friend, Mr. Geoffrey Lloyd, a smooth-faced young man who wrote for one of the more progressive magazines. Miss Vera Claythorne, the new schoolmistress who had arrived in the village only 3 months prior, and Captain Ronald Patterson, a retired naval officer who had settled in St. Mary Mead after inheriting his aunt's cottage. "Jane, darling." Mrs. Bantry swept forward in a rustle of blue silk. "You've met everyone, haven't you? Except perhaps you haven't properly met Miss Claythorne. She's been frightfully busy with the school term." Miss Claythorne extended a slim hand. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, with dark hair severely dressed and intelligent grey eyes that seemed to assess everything with cool precision. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry has spoken of you so often." "How kind," murmured Miss Marple, noting the slight tension in the younger woman's smile. The way her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly. Nerves, perhaps, at dining with relative strangers, or something more. The party proceeded to the dining room at 8 o'clock precisely. The table gleamed with crystal and silver, and the new cooker, Mrs. Shepherd, recently hired from a large household in London, had clearly spared no effort. The first course, a delicate consomme, was pronounced excellent by all. Conversation flowed with the comfortable ease of people who, if not all intimates, were at least determined to be. Agreeable, Dr. Haydock expounded on the new surgery planned for the village. Mrs. Eleanor. Haydock corrected several of his assertions with the confidence of a woman who had been married to a physician for 27 years. Raymond West defended modern poetry against Captain Patterson's assertion that nothing written after 1890 deserved the name. Mr. Lloyd contributed witticisms that were perhaps slightly too clever, and Miss Claythorne listened more than she spoke, though when she did speak, her observations were pointed and perceptive. The second course arrived, grilled sole with a cream sauce, accompanied by asparagus and new potatoes. It was as they were midway through this course that Mrs. Bantry suddenly set down her fork with a small puzzled frown. "Does anyone else find the sauce rather curious?" she inquired, touching her napkin to her lips. Dr. Haydock paused, fork halfway to his mouth. Curious in what way, Dolly? Bitter, distinctly bitter, almost metallic. Miss Marple, who had been observing a robin through the French windows, turned her attention to her own plate. She had taken only a small bite, but yes, there was indeed an unusual bitterness underlying the cream. "I don't taste anything amiss," Captain Pattison declared, consuming another forkful with apparent satisfaction. "Perfectly good sauce, I'd say." But Eleanor Haydock had gone rather pale. "Arthur," she said to Colonel Bantry, "I do feel rather peculiar. Dizzy, somehow." "I say, so do I," Raymond West admitted, setting down his wineglass rather abruptly. His usually ruddy complexion had taken on a greyish tinge. It was then that everything happened with alarming rapidity. Mr. Geoffrey Lloyd gave a strangled gasp and clutched at his throat. Miss Claythorne pushed back from the table, her chair scraping violently against the floor. Captain Pattison attempted to rise, but staggered, grasping the edge of the table for support. "James." Mrs. Bantry's voice rose sharply, addressing the doctor. "What's happening?" Dr. Haydock himself was struggling to stand, medical instinct clearly warring with whatever was affecting his own system. "Poison," he managed to say, his professional demeanor asserting itself even as his face drained of color. Everyone induced vomiting immediately. The dining room descended into chaos. Colonel Bantry, who had eaten less than the others, maintained sufficient composure to shout for the servants. The butler, Simmons, and 2 maids rushed in, their faces white with shock as they took in the scene. Captain Pattison collapsed across his chair. Geoffrey Lloyd retching into his napkin, Eleanor Haydock swaying dangerously, Raymond West gripping the table with whitened knuckles, Miss Claythorne doubled over and gasping for breath, and the Bantrys themselves both looking ill and frightened. Dr. Haydock, drawing on reserves of professional will, barked orders. Simmons telephoned Dr. Griffiths in much Benham immediately. "Tell him possible mass poisoning, suspected food contamination. We need ambulances. Mrs. Bantry, lie down, now. Everyone, lie down where you are if you must, but try to vomit if you can." Miss Marple, who had eaten only that single small bite and had felt merely a slight nausea, moved with quiet efficiency. She helped Mrs. Bantry to the drawing-room sofa, then returned to assist Eleanor Haydock. Through it all, her mind worked with its characteristic precision, noting details: who had eaten what, how much, the exact progression of symptoms, the varying severity of each person's distress. Within 20 minutes, the house was filled with medical personnel. Dr. Griffiths, a capable man from the neighboring town, took charge with brisk authority. One by one, the affected guests were treated, stabilized, and prepared for removal to hospital for observation. The village constable, Constable Pock, had arrived and stood in the hallway looking thoroughly out of his depth as the ambulances departed into the October night. Their bells clanging urgently, Miss Marple remained behind with Colonel Bantry, who had been less severely affected than the others but was shaken and confused. Inspector Slack from Much Benham arrived at 10:30, his face thunderous, demanding to know what sort of criminally incompetent household poisoned its own dinner guests. It was Miss Marple who quietly suggested that perhaps the cream sauce should be analyzed, along with any remaining food. And it was Miss Marple who noticed, as she helped the distressed kitchen staff, that Mrs. Shepherd, the new cook, had disappeared entirely by midnight. The preliminary report came through: arsenic, in quantities that would have been fatal had not Dr. Haydock recognized the symptoms so quickly. 8 people poisoned at a dinner party in peaceful St. Mary Mead, and the cook nowhere to be found. The village would not sleep easily that night. By morning, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead with the extraordinary velocity that only truly shocking information can achieve. Miss Hartnell, emerging from the post office at 9:30, encountered Miss Weatherby outside the butcher's shop, and their subsequent conversation, in urgent undertones that nevertheless carried quite clearly across the high street, established the basic narrative that would dominate village discourse for days to come. Arsenic, my dear. Arsenic in the cream sauce. They say poor Captain Patterson nearly died. And that nice Mr. West, Miss Marple's nephew from London. All of them poisoned, every single guest at the table. But who would do such a thing? And why? Well, they're looking for the cook, aren't they? Mrs. Shepherd? Vanished without a trace, I'm told. Obviously guilty. A cook who poisons an entire dinner party. It seems rather excessive, doesn't it? I mean, if one had a grudge against Mrs. Bantry, surely one wouldn't poison all the guests as well. This observation, sensible though it was, failed to dampen the general conviction that Mrs. Shepherd must be the culprit. By noon, she had been variously described as a woman with shifty eyes, Mrs. Price Ridley. Someone who never properly fitted in Miss Hartnell, and altogether too quiet. If you ask me, the postmistress, though no one had, having spent a largely sleepless night and the early morning at the hospital inquiring after the victims, all of whom were now stable and expected to recover, fully returned to her cottage to find her maid, Cherry, in a state of high excitement. Oh, Miss everyone's talking about it. They say you were there, that you saw everything. Is it true about the arsenic? And that the cook's run away to London, or maybe even to France? Dear me, said Miss Marple mildly, removing her gloves. France seems rather ambitious for someone who's only just committed a crime. One would think she'd want to avoid ports and customs officials. And as for seeing everything, I'm afraid I saw very little beyond what everyone else saw, people becoming very ill very quickly. But Cherry was not to be deflected. Mrs. Bantry's made you know. Lucy, she told my friend Gladys that Inspector Slack was shouting at Colonel Bantry something dreadful, saying he should have checked the cook's references more carefully, and that Mrs. Shepherd's room was found all cleared out, not a thing left behind except an old newspaper. Miss Marple's eyes, which had been mild and slightly vague, suddenly sharpened with interest. An old newspaper. How curious. I don't suppose anyone mentioned what newspaper or what date. Cherry looked disappointed. No, Miss Marple. Just that it was old. A few months old, Lucy said, after Cherry had returned to her duties. Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the window, her knitting needles moving with their customary steady rhythm, though her mind was far from the pattern she was creating. An old newspaper, left behind when everything else had been removed. That suggested either in someone who had planned and executed such a crime, more perhaps that the newspaper had no significance to the person who had occupied that room, or perhaps it had been left deliberately. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors, all ostensibly calling to inquire after Miss Marple's health, but actually burning with curiosity about the events at Gossington Hall. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived first, bringing a seed cake and a determination to extract every possible detail. Of course, I always said there was something peculiar about that woman, too well-spoken for a cook, if you ask me. And those references from London, who can verify anything from London? They might have been completely forged. The references were checked, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Bantry is very thorough about such things. Mrs. Shepherd came from the household of a Lady Tressilian in Mayfair, who gave her an excellent character. Well, characters can be deceiving, can't they? Obviously the woman was unbalanced, probably homicidal. One reads about such things. Miss Hartnell arrived shortly after, followed by the vicar's wife, and then by Mrs. Bantry herself, who had discharged herself from hospital against medical advice and appeared pale but resolute. I cannot lie about in a hospital bed while my household is being torn apart by the police, she declared. Accepting the cup of tea Miss Marple pressed upon her. Inspector Slack has been perfectly horrid, Jane. Horrid, as though Arthur and I deliberately hired a poisoner. We checked her references most carefully. Lady Tressilian's letter was absolutely glowing. I'm sure you did everything properly, Dolly. Tell me, had Mrs. Shepherd seemed at all unusual in the days before the dinner party? Nervous, perhaps, or preoccupied? Mrs. Bantry frowned, considering. Not that I noticed. She was very professional, very correct. Perhaps a little reserved, but then good cooks often are. They don't appreciate interference in their kitchens. The dinner party was meant to be her grand debut, as it were. I'd told her to spare no expense, to show us what she could do. And the menu, did she plan it herself? We discussed it together. I wanted something elegant, but not too fussy. The sole was her suggestion. She said she had a particular recipe for the cream sauce that was very special. I see, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. And did she prepare all the dishes herself? Well, she had young Annie helping her, Annie from the village, you know, who comes in for the heavy work. But Mrs. Shepherd did all the actual cooking. She was quite particular about that. After Mrs. Bantry had departed, promising to rest despite her protestations, Miss Marple sat very still for some time. Young Annie. She made a mental note to speak with Annie when the opportunity arose. By evening, the village had elaborated its theories considerably. It was now generally accepted that Mrs. Shepherd was part of a gang of London criminals who specialized in infiltrating respectable households and poisoning their employers. The motive remained obscure. Some suggested robbery, though nothing had been stolen. Others proposed blackmail, though of whom and for what remained mysteriously vague. Only Mr. the solicitor, when he called upon Miss Marple on his way home from his office, expressed any skepticism. The thing that puzzles me, he said, accepting a glass of sherry, is why poison everyone. If Mrs. Shepherd had a grudge against Mrs. Bantry, or even against Colonel Bantry, why poison all 8 guests? It seems rather indiscriminate for a planned attack. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. That is rather the point, isn't it? One might almost think that the poisoning of 8 people was meant to obscure the poisoning of one particular person. Mr. Petherick set down his glass rather sharply. Good God, Miss Marple. You mean this might have been an attempt to murder one specific guest, with the others merely camouflage? It's a possibility, isn't it? Though of course, I may be quite wrong. I very often am. This was said with such perfect innocence that Mr. Petherick might have believed it, had he not known Miss Marple for 20 years. As darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, the village settled into an uneasy evening. In the hospital at Much Benham, 7 people lay in varying states of recovery and reflection, each considering what had happened, and perhaps, though they might not admit it even to themselves, wondering whether they had been the intended target. And somewhere, Mrs. Shepherd remained absent, neither found nor explained, a convenient villain in a story that Miss Marple was beginning to suspect was far more complicated than it appeared. Inspector Slack was not a man who appreciated interference, and he particularly did not appreciate interference from elderly ladies who fancied themselves detectives. He had made this position abundantly clear on previous occasions, and the events at Gossington Hall had done nothing to soften his stance. Nevertheless, when Miss Marple presented herself at Gossington Hall the following morning, ostensibly to bring Mrs. Bantry a restorative jelly and some magazines, he found himself unable to prevent her gentle infiltration of his investigation. She had a way of simply being present, of sitting quietly in corners with her knitting. That made it extraordinarily difficult to ask her to leave without appearing churlish. The facts are quite straightforward. Inspector Slack was explaining to Colonel Bantry in the study, his voice carrying clearly into the morning room where Miss Marple had settled herself near the door. Mrs. Shepherd prepared the meal. The poison was in the cream sauce. Mrs. Shepherd has disappeared. The conclusion is obvious, but what was her motive? Colonel Bantry asked, sounding bewildered. We'd only employed her for 3 weeks. We'd done nothing to offend her, surely. Who knows what goes on in the mind of a madwoman? Inspector Slack responded impatiently. Perhaps she's one of these anarchists one reads about. Perhaps she has a grudge against the upper classes. The point is, we need to find her, and find her quickly. And have you? Miss Marple's voice, mild and inquiring, came from the doorway. Both men started slightly. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack said with barely concealed irritation. This is police business. Of course, Inspector. I was merely curious. You see, I was present when poor Mrs. Bantry and the others were taken ill, and naturally one wonders. Have you found Mrs. Shepherd? Not yet, but we will. We've circulated her description to all police stations and ports. She won't get far. I'm sure you're quite right. Tell me, Inspector, when you searched her room, did you find anything of interest? Any clue as to where she might have gone? Inspector Slack hesitated, then seemed to decide that the information was harmless enough. The room was cleared out. Nothing left except an old newspaper, dated July 15th. Can't think why she'd leave that behind. July 15th, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. May I ask, was it a London paper or a local one? London. The Times. Nothing of any relevance in it, as far as we could see. Just the usual political news, social announcements, advertisements. Might I see it, do you think? I find newspapers so interesting, don't you? One can learn such a great deal about people from what they choose to read. Inspector Slack looked as though he might refuse, but Colonel Bantry, who had a soft spot for Miss Marple, intervened. I don't see why not, Slack. The thing's of no use to you. By your own admission, with considerable reluctance, Inspector Slack produced the newspaper, which had been folded and refolded until certain sections were prominently displayed. Miss Marple accepted it with thanks and settled back into her chair, her eyes moving over the pages with careful attention. The front page contained international news tensions in Europe, political debates in Parliament. She turned to the social announcements, births, marriages, deaths. Her gaze travelled down the columns, pausing here and there. Then she examined the advertisements. Properties for sale, positions wanted, personal notices. Very interesting, she murmured, more to herself than to the others. Found something? Colonel Bantry asked hopefully. Perhaps. Or perhaps I'm seeing patterns where none exist. It's a failing of mine. She looked up with her gentle smile. Tell me, Colonel Bantry, Do you happen to know if any of your guests that evening had connections to London society? I mean, beyond Mr. West and Mr. Lloyd, who obviously lived there." Colonel Bantry frowned, considering. "Well, Dr. Haydock trained at Bart's, of course, years ago. Captain Pattison served with the Navy, stationed at Greenwich for some years. Miss Claythornham, not entirely sure of her background, actually. She came with excellent references from a school in Hampshire, but beyond that." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "And you checked her references, of course." "Well, Dolly did. The school board did, certainly. She wouldn't have been appointed otherwise." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her needles clicking in their gentle rhythm. "Of course, and I'm sure they were all perfectly in order. Inspector, I wonder, have you had an opportunity to interview all of the guests yet? I imagine they must all be anxious to help in any way they can." Inspector Slack puffed out his chest slightly. "I've taken preliminary statements from those who were well enough to speak. They'll all need to give formal statements once they're fully recovered. Not that I expect them to tell me much. They were all too busy being poisoned to notice anything useful." "Quite so. Though sometimes people notice things without realizing they've noticed them, if you take my meaning. A word, a gesture, something slightly out of place." Miss Marple paused, appearing to consider her knitting pattern. "I was wondering, Inspector, whether you'd had an opportunity to speak with young Annie, the girl who was helping in the kitchen, the scullery maid." "Yes, of course. She said Mrs. Shepherd prepared everything herself. Annie only helped with the washing up and the carrying of dishes." "Did Annie mention anything about Mrs. Shepherd's demeanor that evening? Whether she seemed nervous or preoccupied?" Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with the air of a man humoring a persistent child. "She said Mrs. Shepherd was very particular about everything being just right, that she shooed Annie out of the kitchen several times, that she insisted on preparing the cream sauce herself without any assistance." "How very interesting," Miss Marple said softly. "And did Annie see Mrs. Shepherd prepare the sauce?" "She saw her preparing something. Cream, butter, herbs. Nothing unusual. The girl's not very bright. Couldn't tell me much beyond that." Miss Marple made a small sound that might have been agreement, or might have been something else entirely. She rose from her chair, folding the newspaper carefully. "Might I borrow this for a day or two, Inspector? I promise to return it." Inspector Slack waved a dismissive hand. "Keep it, if you like. It's of no use to the investigation." After Miss Marple had departed, Colonel Bantry turned to the inspector with a troubled expression. "You don't think there's anything in what she's suggesting, do you? About one particular person being the target?" "What I think," Inspector Slack said firmly, "is that we have a clear case of a deranged cook who poisoned a household and fled. When we find Mrs. Shepherd, she'll hang for it. And that will be that." But Miss Marple, walking slowly back to her cottage with the newspaper tucked carefully in her basket, was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about a cream sauce prepared in absolute privacy. She was thinking about 8 people poisoned, seemingly at random. And she was thinking about a newspaper dated July 15th, opened to a page of death notices and personal advertisements, left behind in an otherwise empty room. There was a pattern here, she was certain. The kind of pattern that emerged when one understood human nature in all its complexity, its loves and hates, its desperate gambles and careful calculations, its capacity for both sacrifice and murder. Someone at that dinner party had wanted someone else dead. The poisoning of 8 had been meant to conceal the murder of 1. The question was, who had wanted whom dead, and more importantly, why? By the time she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple had formulated a plan. It would require discretion, patience, and perhaps a few minor deceptions of the sort she generally disapproved of, but occasionally found necessary. She would need to speak with each of the guests separately and carefully. She would need to understand their lives, their secrets, their connections to one another and to the wider world, and she would need to discover what, in a newspaper dated July 15th, had been worth leaving behind as a silent message or a warning by the 3rd day after the poisoning. Mrs. Shepherd had been elevated to the status of a criminal mastermind in the collective imagination of St. Mary Mead. She was reported to have been seen in locations ranging from Dover to Liverpool, though none of these sightings proved credible upon investigation. Inspector Slack, whose temper had not improved with the passage of time, had been forced to admit that the woman seemed to have vanished entirely, which proves her guilt. He declared to anyone who would listen, an innocent woman doesn't disappear into thin air. The victims of the poisoning had all been released from hospital and were recovering in their respective homes. Miss Marple, exercising the privilege of both age and acquaintance, had called upon each of them in turn, bringing small gifts and expressions of concern that masked a more penetrating curiosity. Her first visit had been to Dr. and Mrs. Haydock. Dr. Haydock, still pale and noticeably thinner, had received her in his study with a wry smile. "Come to investigate, Miss Marple. I know that look. You had it during that business with Colonel Prothero. I'm merely concerned for your health, Doctor. Such a terrible experience. Terrible indeed. Another hour, and we'd have been past help. As it was, we came damnably close." He paused, his face grave. The arsenic was concentrated in the cream sauce. Someone put a lethal dose into that tureen. If Dolly hadn't noticed the taste when she did, if I hadn't recognized the symptoms. He didn't finish the thought. You saved everyone's lives, Doctor. You should be very proud. I did my duty. Nothing more. He looked at her keenly. You don't believe it was the cook, do you? I'm not certain what I believe yet. Tell me, Doctor, had you met Mrs. Shepherd before that evening? Never. Why do you ask? No particular reason. Simply trying to understand whether she might have had some connection to any of the guests. Whether this might have been personal rather than random. Mrs. Eleanor Haydock, who had been listening from her chair by the window, spoke up sharply. Personal? You mean someone at that dinner party was specifically targeted? But that's absurd. We were all poisoned equally. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. That is rather the point, isn't it? If one wanted to murder a specific person, what better way to disguise it than to poison everyone? The victim becomes simply one among many, with no apparent reason for selection. Dr. Haydock leaned back in his chair, his expression arrested. Good God, I hadn't thought of it that way. But surely that would require someone other than the cook to have administered the poison. Not necessarily. The cook might have been working on someone's behalf. Or, Miss Marple paused delicately. The cook might not have administered the poison at all. But the poison was in the sauce, which she prepared. Yes, but the sauce was in a tureen, which was brought to the table. Did anyone actually see Mrs. Shepherd add poison to it? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Miss Marple's next visit was to Captain Patterson, who received her in the cottage he had inherited from his aunt. He had recovered better than most, being of robust naval constitution. but there was a wariness in his manner that had not been there before. "Damned unsettling thing," he said, pouring tea with a hand that trembled only slightly. "One expects danger at sea, in wartime, but to be poisoned at a dinner party in one's own village. It's unnatural. Had you known any of the other guests well, Captain? Before that evening, I mean. Barely knew any of them. That's what made it so pleasant. Good conversation, new acquaintances, or so I thought." He frowned. "Though I did have a slight acquaintance with Miss Claythorne, actually. Ran into her in the village about a month ago, and she mentioned she'd known my aunt years ago when she was teaching at some school in Surrey. Small world, what? Indeed. How very interesting. Your aunt, she passed away last year, didn't she?" "That's right. Left me the cottage quite unexpectedly. We weren't particularly close. She was my father's elder sister, a rather formidable woman. But she'd outlived her immediate family, and I was next in line." "I see. And did Miss Claythorne visit your aunt at all before her death?" Captain Patterson looked surprised by the question. "I've no idea. Why do you ask?" "No reason, really. Just my curious nature." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "Tell me, had you noticed anything unusual about Mrs. Shepherd that evening? Anything that struck you as odd?" "Can't say I did. Didn't see the woman at all, actually. The servants brought in the courses, and we ate them. That's how dinner parties work, isn't it?" He paused, then added thoughtfully, "Though I do remember thinking the cream sauce was particularly good. Had 2 helpings, in fact. Probably why I was hit so hard." "Very likely," Miss Marple agreed. "Some people are more susceptible than others, I understand." Her visit to Raymond West and his friend Mr. Geoffrey Lloyd proved equally enlightening, though in different ways. The 2 men had taken rooms at the Blue Boar while they recovered, and they received Miss Marple together, both looking considerably worse for wear. "Aunt Jane," Raymond said, kissing her cheek. "I'm so sorry you had to witness all that. Must have been dreadful for you." "I'm quite all right, dear. It's you I'm concerned about. Both of you." She looked at Mr. Lloyd, who was sprawled in an arm. "You write for magazines, I understand." "That's right. The Progressive Review, mainly. Political and social commentary." He managed a weak smile. "Though I don't suppose a poisoning at a country dinner party is quite our usual subject matter. You never know what might inspire an article," Miss Marple said lightly. "Had you known any of the other guests before that evening?" "I'd met the Colonel and Mrs. Bantry once, at Raymond's suggestion. We were thinking of doing a piece on country house entertaining, the death of an English tradition, that sort of thing. The others were strangers to me. Except," Raymond interjected, "you did say you thought you'd seen Miss Claythorne before, didn't you, Geoffrey? You mentioned it on the drive down." Mr. Lloyd frowned. "Did I? I can't remember. She has one of those faces, you know, classic features. She might remind me of any number of women." "Of course," Miss Marple said, but she noted the way Mr. Lloyd's hands tensed slightly on the arms of his chair, the way his eyes slid away from hers. There was something there, something he didn't wish to discuss. Her final visit was to Miss Claythorne herself, who lodged in a neat set of rooms above the stationer's shop. The schoolmistress received her with polite reserve, serving tea in delicate china cups and maintaining the careful composure of a woman who guarded her privacy closely. "I'm glad to see you've recovered so well, Miss Claythorne. It must have been terribly frightening." "It was unpleasant," Miss Claythorne acknowledged, "though Dr. Haydock's quick thinking undoubtedly saved us all." I'm grateful to be alive, as are we all. Tell me, are you enjoying St. Mary Mead? I know teaching can be quite demanding. The village is pleasant enough. The children are reasonably well behaved. It suits my purposes. Had you lived in this part of the country before? No, I taught in Surrey previously, and before that in Hampshire. I've moved about rather frequently. Teaching posts tend to be temporary, of course. I understand you'd met Captain Patterson's aunt at some point. Something flickered behind Miss Claythorne's eye, surprise, perhaps, or wariness. Did the captain mention that? Yes, I believe I taught at a school where Miss Patterson served as a governor. Years ago. I barely remember her. Memory is such a curious thing, isn't it? We remember the strangest details and forget what seems important. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Did you have any acquaintance with Mrs. Shepherd before the dinner party? None whatsoever. I'd never seen the woman before that evening, and I didn't see her then. I merely ate her cooking, unfortunately. Yes, that was unfortunate for all of us. Though I did notice, Miss Claythorne, that you seemed somewhat nervous during the meal. Before anyone became ill, I mean, did I? Miss Claythorne's voice was carefully neutral. I don't recall feeling particularly nervous. Perhaps I was simply preoccupied. I had examinations to prepare for the following week. But observing the younger woman's controlled expression, the careful placement of her hands, the almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders, thought otherwise. Miss Claythorne had been nervous that evening, deeply nervous. Miss Marple wondered whether that nervousness had preceded the poisoning or had been caused by it. That evening, sitting in her cottage with her knitting and her thoughts, Miss Marple reviewed what she had learned. Several things stood out. Captain Patterson had inherited unexpectedly from an aunt whom Miss Claythorne had known. Mr. Lloyd had possibly recognized Miss Claythorne, though he denied it. Miss Claythorne herself was nervous and evasive, and all of them, along with the Haydocks, the Bantrys, and Raymond and Geoffrey, had been poisoned apparently at random by a cook who had subsequently vanished. Inspector Slack was convinced of Mrs. Shepherd's guilt. The village was convinced of Mrs. Shepherd's guilt. Even the victims themselves seemed to accept that the cook had been a madwoman, who had poisoned them all in some incomprehensible fit of anarchistic rage. Only Miss Marple, turning the pieces of the puzzle over in her mind, thought otherwise. And only Miss Marple noticed that while everyone spoke of Mrs. Shepherd as the obvious culprit, no one, not the police, not the servants, not even the victims themselves, could provide any real information about the woman. She had appeared, worked for 3 weeks, and disappeared, leaving behind nothing but an old newspaper and a reputation for competent cooking. It was almost, Miss Marple thought, as though Mrs. Shepherd had never really existed at all. Or perhaps, and this was more disturbing, as though she had existed only for the specific purpose of being blamed for 8 attempted murders, which raised a very interesting question indeed. If Mrs. Shepherd had not poisoned the dinner party, who had? And more importantly, which of the 8 guests had been the intended victim? Miss Marple had always believed that the most significant clues were often those that appeared insignificant to others. A fallen rose petal, an out-of-place teacup, a glance exchanged between 2 people who claimed to be strangers. These were the details that revealed truth when examined with proper attention. The newspaper left in Mrs. Shepherd's room was such a clue. Inspector Slack had dismissed it as meaningless, but Miss Marple knew better. People did not accidentally leave newspapers behind when fleeing from a crime. Either they forgot them in genuine haste, or they left them deliberately. She spread the paper on her dining table and examined it systematically. The Times, dated July 15th, 5 months before the dinner party. The front page contained nothing remarkable. Parliamentary debates, international tensions, the usual concerns of empire and economy. She turned to the society pages. Here were the births and marriages that punctuated the rhythm of upper-class life. The engagement of a baronet's daughter to a manufacturer's son. The birth of a third child to Viscount and Viscountess Ambrose. A golden wedding anniversary celebrated by Sir Gerald and Lady Fortescue. And then the deaths. Miss Marple read each notice carefully. Most were unremarkable ladyly persons dying of natural causes, their accomplishments and survivors duly noted. But one notice caught her attention. On July 10th, at her residence in Mayfair, Lady Beatrice Tressilian, aged 68, after a brief illness. Devoted mother to John Tressilian, grandmother to Elizabeth and Michael. Private funeral service to be held. No flowers, donations to the hospital for sick children in her memory. Lady Beatrice Tressilian. The name resonated in Miss Marple's memory. Where had she recently heard that name? And then it came to her. Lady Tressilian had been Mrs. Shepherd's previous employer, the one who had provided such glowing references. Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting forgotten in her lap. A wealthy woman dying after a brief illness. A cook who had served in her household, securing a new position shortly after. And 5 months later, that same cook disappeared after poisoning an entire dinner party. Was there a connection, or was she seeing patterns where none existed? She turned to the personal advertisements, another section that had been marked with faint pencil lines. These advertisements were the Victorian and Edwardian eras equivalent of coded messagescriptic notes between lovers. Appeals for lost relatives. Notices of meetings and arrangements that required discretion. Most were entirely opaque to an outsider. Red sunset at dawn. All is forgiven. Return home, M. Or the package has been delivered to the usual location. Await further instructions. GW, B. One advertisement stood out. Claythorne. The matter in Surrey is concluded. Discretion maintained as agreed. Contact through usual channels if further service required. PM. Miss Marple read it 3 times. Claythorne, the same surname as the schoolmistress. Of course, it might be coincidence. Claythorne was not an uncommon name. But combined with the death notice for Lady Tressilian, whose former cook had just poisoned a dinner party, and the fact that this particular newspaper had been left behind in Mrs. Shepherd's room, coincidence seemed increasingly unlikely. Miss Marple's contemplation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Cherry announced that young Annie, the scullery maid from Gossington Hall, was asking to speak with her. Show her in, Cherry, and bring some tea and those biscuits I baked yesterday. Annie entered nervously, twisting her apron in reddened hands. She was perhaps 17, plain and sturdy, with the wary expression of someone who had learned that authority figures generally meant trouble. Please, sit down. Annie, you're not in any difficulty. I simply wanted to ask you a few questions about that terrible evening. If you don't mind. Mrs. Bantry said I should tell you whatever you asked, Miss Marple. And the inspector, he talked to me too, though he weren't very patient. Inspectors often aren't. Now, tell me about Mrs. Shepherd. What was she like to work with? Annie relaxed slightly at this non-threatening question. She were very particular, Miss. Everything had to be just so. Clean hands, clean aprons, everything in its place. But she weren't mean about it, not like some cooks I've worked under. She explained things proper like when I didn't understand. And that evening, the evening of the dinner party. Can you tell me what happened in the kitchen? Well, Mrs. Shepherd had been cooking all day. The soup in the morning, then the fish, and she made that special sauce for it. She were very proud of that sauce, said it were a recipe from her previous household, very refined. Did you help her prepare the sauce? No, miss. She said it were too delicate for me to be involved. She made it herself. Cream and butter and herbs and something else, though I couldn't see what. She kept sending me off to polish the silver or fold the napkins. How many times would you say you were sent away? Annie thought carefully. 3 or 4 times, miss. She said I were too distracting, breathing down her neck while she worked, and the sauce did it go straight from the saucepan to the tureen. Yes, miss. Mrs. Shepherd poured it into the tureen herself, then put it on the warming plate. She were very fussy about the temperature being just right. Who carried the tureen to the dining room? Mr. Simmons, the butler. Same as always for formal dinners. Mrs. Shepherd never left the kitchen herself. She were too busy with the next course. I see. And after the guests became ill, what happened in the kitchen then? Annie's face crumpled slightly at the memory. It were terrible, miss. Mr. Simmons came running in, shouting that everyone were poisoned and to get Dr. Griffiths on the telephone. Mrs. Shepherd went white as a sheet-eye, thought she were going to faint. She kept saying no, no, it's impossible, over and over. And then there were ambulances and police and everything were in confusion. I didn't see Mrs. Shepherd after that. I was sent to sit in the servants' hall with the other maids, and when I asked where Mrs. Shepherd were, nobody knew. She'd just gone. Miss Marple thanked Annie and sent her away with £0.50 and the remainder of the biscuits. After the girl had left, she returned to the newspaper, but her mind was on what Annie had told her. Mrs. Shepherd had prepared the sauce alone, in secret, sending Annie away repeatedly. She had poured it into the tureen herself. And then she had been shocked, genuinely shocked, by Annie's account when the guests became ill, which suggested either that Mrs. Shepherd was an excellent actress, or that she had not knowingly poisoned the sauce she had prepared. But if Mrs. Shepherd hadn't poisoned the sauce, who had? The butler had carried the tureen to the dining room, but Simmons had been with the Bantrys for 20 years and was above suspicion. The other servants had been accounted for. The guests had been seated at the table when the tureen arrived, unless someone had added the poison to the sauce, after it left the kitchen but before it was served. But when and how? Miss Marple rose and walked to her window, looking out at the twilight settling over St. Mary Mead. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but it was still incomplete. She needed more information about Lady Tressilian's death, about Miss Claythorne's background, about the connections that bound these apparently random people together. She was considering how to proceed when inspiration struck. Mr. The solicitor maintained connections with legal firms throughout England. If Lady Tressilian had died as recently as July, her estate would still be in probate. There would be records, documents, perhaps even interesting details about her household and her death. And if there was a mysterious advertisement concerning Claythorne and the matter in Surrey, Mr. Petherick might have ways of discovering what that matter had been. It was too late to call on the solicitor that evening, but tomorrow would do. Miss Marple had learned patience over many decades of observation. The truth would reveal itself. but only to those who asked the right questions in the right way. She folded the newspaper carefully and placed it in her writing desk. Then she settled in her favorite chair with her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the quiet room. To an observer, she would have appeared to be a typical elderly lady spending a peaceful evening at home. But behind those mild blue eyes, a formidable intelligence was at work, sorting through lies and evasions, connecting disparate facts, and slowly, methodically, constructing a picture of murder most carefully planned and most nearly perfectly executed. Nearly perfect, but not quite. Because whoever had planned this crime had made one crucial mistake. They had not anticipated that Miss Jane Marple would be present at the dinner party, and that she would survive to investigate it. The morning brought an unexpected development. Miss Marple, arriving at Mr. Petherick's office at precisely 10 o'clock, found the solicitor in a state of considerable agitation. "Miss Marple, I was just about to send for you. The most extraordinary thing, I've received a letter from a firm of solicitors in London. Tressilian, Winwood and Hobbs. They're inquiring about a Miss Vera Claythorne, currently employed as a schoolmistress in St. Mary Mead. It seems there's a matter concerning the estate of their late client, Lady Beatrice Tressilian." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of satisfaction. The pattern was revealing itself more quickly than she had anticipated. "How very interesting, Mr. Petherick. What sort of matter?" "They're rather vague about that, which is unusual for solicitors. They merely ask if I can confirm Miss Claythorne's current address and whether she is, in their words, of good character and standing in the community. Odd sort of inquiry, what?" "Very odd indeed. Mr. Petherick, I wonder if you might do me a favor. Could you contact this firm and arrange a conversation about their inquiry? I believe it may have some bearing on the poisoning at Gossington Hall." The solicitor's eyebrows rose dramatically. The poisoning. But surely that was the work of this cookwoman, Shepherd. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. I'm beginning to think that Mrs. Shepherd may have been less of a villain than a, shall we say, convenient scapegoat. Mr. Petherick agreed to make inquiries, and Miss Marple departed, her mind working rapidly. Lady Tressilian's solicitors were asking about Miss Claythorne. Lady Tressilian's former cook had poisoned a dinner party at which Miss Claythorne was a guest, and a newspaper advertisement had mentioned Claythorne and the matter in Surrey. Surrey. Captain Patterson's aunt had lived in Surrey, and Miss Claythorne had taught at a school there. Captain Patterson had inherited unexpectedly from that aunt. The pattern was becoming clearer, though still incomplete. Her next stop was the vicarage, where the vicar's wife, who served as secretary to the school board, maintained files on all the teachers in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Clement received her warmly, if a bit curiously. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you. Is this about the church bazaar, or—" "Actually, I was hoping you might help me with a small matter. It concerns Miss Claythorne, our schoolmistress. I'm assisting with a reference inquiry quite routine, and I need to verify some details of her employment history." This was not quite truthful, but Miss Marple had long ago decided that small deceptions in service of justice were permissible. If regrettable, Mrs. Clement obligingly produced Miss Claythorne's file. Such an excellent teacher. The children adore her, and her references were impeccable. Miss Marple examined the documents carefully. Miss Vera Claythorne, aged 32, unmarried. Previous employment at a girls' school in Hampshire, and before that at Wentworth Academy in Surrey. Character references from both headmistresses praised her teaching abilities, her discipline and her dedication. But there was something else, a gap. Miss Claythorne had left Wentworth Academy in Surrey in June 2 years ago. She had not taken up her position in Hampshire until September. What had she done during those 3 months? Mrs. Clement, do you happen to know what Miss Claythorne did between her positions? It's not mentioned in the file. Oh, I believe she mentioned taking a private position for the summer. Tutoring, I think, or perhaps serving as a governess. Quite common for teachers during the holidays. Of course. How sensible. But Miss Marple was thinking, a private position during the summer 2 years ago, and an advertisement in July of this year mentioning Claythorne and the matter in Surrey. She thanked Mrs. Clement and departed, her next destination already decided. She would call upon Miss Claythorne again, but this time her questions would be more pointed. Miss Claythorne received her with poorly concealed reluctance. I wasn't expecting you again so soon. I hope I'm not intruding. I was merely wondering if you might help me with a small puzzle. You see, I've been looking at that newspaper that was left in Mrs. Shepherd's room, and I came across the most curious advertisement. She produced the paper, opened to the relevant page. Here, Claythorne. The matter in Surrey is concluded. I wondered if you might know anything about it. The colour drained from Miss Claythorne's face. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, very quietly, you should leave this alone, Miss Marple, for your own good. I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, 8 people were nearly murdered, including my own nephew. I cannot simply pretend ignorance when I believe I'm beginning to understand what really happened. Miss Claythorne walked to the window, her back to Miss Marple. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled, but held an undercurrent of emotion. What do you think you understand? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that you had a private position 2 summers ago in Surrey. I think something happened during that position, something that you wanted kept secret. I think Lady Beatrice Tressilian's death last July may have been connected to that secret, and I think the poisoning at Gossington Hall was an attempt to murder you, disguised as a random act of madness by a cook who may or may not have existed as we believed. Miss Claythorne turned, and Miss Marple was struck by the anguish in her face. You're very clever, Miss Marple. Too clever, perhaps. But you don't understand. But if that's not true, if someone else orchestrated this poisoning, that person may try again. Not just against you, but against anyone they perceive as a threat. Miss Claythorne closed her eyes briefly, as though making a decision she had hoped to avoid. Very well. But what I tell you must remain between us, at least for now. It involves other people, people who could be harmed if this became public. I can make no promises about what I must eventually reveal, but I will be as discreet as circumstances allow. Miss Claythorne sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. 2 years ago, I was engaged as a governess for the summer by a family in Surrey. The Hamiltons. They had a daughter, Beatrice, aged 9, and they wanted someone to oversee her education during the holiday months. It seemed a pleasant position, and I needed the money. She paused, her face troubled. The family also had a son, Cyril, aged 7. A bright child, but willful. He was particularly fascinated by the sea, lived near the coast. Mrs. Hamilton had expressly forbidden him from swimming without supervision, as the currents were dangerous. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settling over her. She knew where this story was going. One afternoon, I was giving Beatrice her lessons. Cyril was supposed to be in the nursery with his nanny, but the nanny had gone to the village on an errand, and Cyril Cyril slipped away. He went to the beach. He went into the water. Miss Claythorne's voice had become barely audible. When they found him, it was too late. He had been swept out by the current. He drowned, and you were blamed, Miss Marple said softly. There was an inquest. The verdict was accidental death. But Mrs. Hamilton, she blamed me. She said I should have been watching both children, that I had been negligent. The nanny blamed me as well, said I had told her it was acceptable to go to the village, which was a lie, but who would believe a governess over a long-serving nanny? And the Hamiltons, what happened to them? Mr. Hamilton suffered a complete nervous collapse. The family fell apart. Mrs. Hamilton became obsessed with the idea that I had been criminally negligent, that I should be punished. She wrote letters to the school board in Hampshire, trying to prevent me from teaching. She threatened to expose me, to ruin my career. But she didn't succeed. No, because someone intervened. Miss Claythorne's voice was bitter. Someone who offered to handle Mrs. Hamilton for me, to ensure that she would stop making trouble, that my past would remain buried, and that someone was... I don't know their name. I received letters, typed letters, never signed. They said they could help me, that they had experience in such matters. They asked for money, which I paid. And shortly after, Mrs. Hamilton stopped her campaign. I heard later that she had been visited by someone claiming to represent a solicitor's firm. Someone who convinced her that pursuing the matter would result in legal action against her for harassment. Miss Marple's mind was racing. And you think this person, this anonymous helper, may have been involved in Lady Tressilian's death? Lady Tressilian was Mrs. Hamilton's mother. I didn't know that at the time Hamilton was Mrs. Hamilton's married name, you see. But when I saw the death notice in July, I recognized the obituary details. Lady Tressilian's daughter, Sarah Hamilton, survived by her 2 children. But only one child was mentioned by name, Beatrice, not Cyril. So Lady Tressilian was the grandmother of the boy who drowned, and she died after a brief illness 5 months ago, just before her former cook came to work for Mrs. Bantry and subsequently poisoned a dinner party at which you were a guest. You see why I've been frightened, Miss Marple. I think someone has been manipulating events around me. I think Lady Tressilian's death may not have been natural. I think Mrs. Shepherd was hired to poison me with the other guests, merely camouflage. And I think the person behind it all is someone who knows my secret, someone who may have helped me once, but who now... She trailed off, unable to finish. Someone who now wants you dead, Miss Marple completed softly. But why? What would they gain from your death? I don't know. That's what terrifies me. Unless, she hesitated, unless they think I know something about Lady Tressilian's death. Or unless they're afraid I'll eventually make the connection and expose them. Miss Marple sat in silence for a moment, her mind arranging and rearranging the pieces of this increasingly complex puzzle. Lady Tressilian, dying of a brief illness, possibly poisoned by her own cook. That same cook, or someone using her identity, arriving in St. Mary Mead and poisoning a dinner party. Miss Claythorne, connected to Lady Tressilian's family through tragedy, present at the dinner party. And someone unknown, pulling the strings from the shadows. Miss Claythorne, I need you to think very carefully. Among the guests at that dinner party, did anyone seem particularly interested in you? Did anyone ask you questions about your past, your previous positions? Mr. Lloyd asked where I'd taught before. He said I seemed familiar, but I'd never seen him before in my life. I'm certain of it. What about Captain Patterson? He mentioned that I'd known his aunt. But that was true, she was on the board of governors at Wentworth Academy. I barely knew her, though, and his aunt died last year, leaving him the cottage and a comfortable inheritance. Another death, another inheritance. Tell me, do you know how Captain Patterson's aunt died? I know, I assumed it was natural causes. She was quite elderly. Assumptions can be dangerous, Miss Marple murmured. I think, Miss Claythorne, that we need to discover more about these deaths. And we need to do so quickly, before whoever is behind this decides that you remain too dangerous to live. After leaving Miss Claythorne, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, her mind working through the implications of what she had learned. A pattern was indeed emerging, but it was darker and more complex than she had initially suspected. Someone was killing people and making their deaths appear natural or accidental. Someone had helped Miss Claythorne escape the consequences of the drowning in Surrey, but at what price? And someone had orchestrated the poisoning at Gossington Hall, using poor Mrs. Shepherd as an unwitting or coerced accomplice. But who? And more importantly, why? The answer, Miss Marple felt certain, lay in understanding the connections between all the deaths. Lady Tressilian, Captain Patterson's aunt, the drowned boy, Cyril Hamilton, and possibly others she didn't yet know about. A killer who used poison, who planned meticulously, who hid behind false identities and manufactured evidence, who killed not from passion but from cold calculation, and who might, even now, be planning their next move. The blow fell 3 days later, just as Miss Marple was beginning to assemble the evidence she needed to present her theory to Inspector Slack. She was at home, composing a careful letter to Lady Tressilian's solicitors, when Cherry rushed in, her face white with shock. Miss Marple, it's terrible. Mr. Lloyd, Mr. Geoffrey Lloyd, he's been found dead. Miss Marple's heart sank. She had feared something like this, but hoping to prevent it and succeeding were different matters entirely. Where? How? At the Blue Boar. They say he took poison, that he killed himself. But Mr. West, he's saying it can't be true, that Geoffrey would never do such a thing. Miss Marple was already reaching for her coat. Tell me everything you know, Cherry, as we walk there. The story, as related by Cherry, who had it from the butcher's boy, who had it from the publican's wife, was this. Geoffrey Lloyd had been found in his room at the Blue Boar at approximately 11 o'clock that morning. He had failed to come down to breakfast, which was unusual, and when the maid went to inquire, she found him unconscious on the floor. Dr. Haydock had been summoned, but arrived too late. Mr. Lloyd was dead by the time Miss Marple reached the Blue Boar. The police had arrived, and the building was in chaos. Inspector Slack was in Mr. Lloyd's room, his face thunderous. Dr. Haydock stood in the hallway, looking grim and exhausted. The same poison, he told Miss Marple without preamble. Arsenic. The same as the dinner party. But this time, a fatal dose. A fatal dose administered how? He appears to have taken it in his morning coffee. The cup is still there, half finished, residue at the bottom, and the assumption is suicide. That's what Inspector Slack is saying. He found a note in Lloyd's room, you see. A confession of sorts. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. Might I see this note? Dr. Haydock hesitated, then nodded. I suppose it can't hurt. Come with me, in the dead man's room. Inspector Slack was directing constables and examining evidence. He looked up at Miss Marple's entrance with barely concealed irritation. This is a crime scene, Miss Marple. You can't just, Inspector. I believe I may have information relevant to this death, and to the poisoning at Gossington Hall, that got his attention. What sort of information? First, might I see the note that was found? Reluctantly, Inspector Slack handed her a piece of hotel stationery, covered in hasty handwriting. Miss Marple read, "I can't bear the guilt any longer. What I did was unforgivable. I thought I could live with it, but I was wrong. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. Let this be the end of it." Miss Marple read it twice, then looked up. This is supposed to be a confession to the poisoning at Gossington Hall. Obviously, he poisoned everyone at the dinner party, probably in some sort of mad scheme to kill one person. Then, racked with guilt, he took his own life. Case closed. I see. Tell me, Inspector, did Mr. Lloyd have any access to the kitchen at Gossington Hall before the dinner party? Any opportunity to add poison to the cream sauce? Inspector Slack frowned. Well, no. He arrived with Mr. West just before dinner, and they were shown directly to the drawing room. But he must have done it somehow. And his motive for poisoning 8 people, 7 of whom he'd never met before. That's what we need to determine. Perhaps he was hired to do it. Perhaps there's some connection we haven't discovered yet. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly, Mr. Lloyd didn't poison anyone. Perhaps he was murdered himself, and this note was forged to make his death appear to be a guilty suicide. Forged. That's quite an accusation, Miss Marple. What evidence do you have? Look at the handwriting, Inspector. It's hasty, irregular. Now look at these letters Mr. Lloyd wrote to magazines and newspapers. She produced several clippings from her handbag. She had collected them during her research into Mr. Lloyd's background. His normal handwriting is quite different. Neater, more controlled. This note was written by someone under considerable duress, or by someone attempting to imitate his hand. Dr. Haydock examined the samples, then the note. By God, she's right. The letter formations are similar, but the overall character is quite different. This could be a forgery. Inspector Slack was beginning to look less certain. But even if the note is forged, that doesn't mean he didn't kill himself. People's handwriting changes under emotional stress. True, Miss Marple agreed. But consider this. If Mr. Lloyd were genuinely guilty and genuinely suicidal, why write such a vague confession? Why not specify what he was guilty of? And why remain in St. Mary Mead for 3 days after the poisoning, knowing he would certainly be discovered eventually? Wouldn't a guilty man flee? Then what are you suggesting? That someone poisoned him the same way they poisoned everyone at the dinner party? I'm suggesting that Mr. Lloyd knew something dangerous. Something that someone wanted to keep hidden. And when that someone realized he knew it, they eliminated him and arranged the scene to make it appear to be either suicide or a guilty man's final act. Raymond West appeared in the doorway, his face ravaged with grief and anger. She's right, Inspector. Jeffrey didn't kill himself, and he certainly didn't poison anyone. He was investigating something he'd been acting strangely the past 2 days, asking odd questions, spending hours writing letters. He said he'd discovered something important, but wouldn't tell me what until he was certain. Letters. What letters? I don't know. But he posted several of them yesterday afternoon. 2 solicitors in London, I think, and 2 some newspaper archives. Miss Marple felt pieces clicking into place. He was investigating Lady Tressilian's death, wasn't he? And possibly Captain Patterson's aunt's death as well. Raymond stared at her. How did you know that? He mentioned those names, but I didn't understand the connection. Aunt Jane, what's going on? What's going on, Miss Marple said, addressing both Raymond and Inspector Slack, is that we are dealing with a multiple murderer. Someone who has killed at least 3 people, Lady Tressilian, Captain Patterson's aunt. And now Mr. Lloyd, someone who attempted to kill 8 people at Gossington Hall, with Miss Claythorne as the likely primary target. And someone who is very, very clever at making murder appear to be natural death or accident. Inspector Slack had gone pale. You're saying there's a serial killer in St. Mary Mead? Not exactly. I don't believe the murders are random. I believe their connected ditch victim either knew something dangerous or stood in the way of something the killer wanted. Mr. Lloyd clearly discovered some connection between the deaths, and he was killed for it. But who? And why? I have a theory, Miss Marple said, but I need to confirm certain facts before I can present it. In the meantime, Inspector, I strongly suggest you place Miss Claythorne under protection. I believe she remains in danger. Why Miss Claythorne specifically? Because she's the link, don't you see? She connects to the Hamiltons through the drowning. The Hamiltons connect to Lady and I suspect Captain Patterson's aunt connects to the same chain of events, though I don't yet know how. Inspector Slack, to his credit, took her seriously. Within an hour, a constable had been posted outside Miss Claythorne's lodgings, and telegrams had been sent to London requesting information about Lady Tressilian's estate and the circumstances of Captain Patterson's aunt's death. Miss Marple returned home, her mind racing. Geoffrey Lloyd had been investigating the deaths and had discovered something important. He had written letters to solicitors, to newspaper archives. He had been gathering evidence, and someone had killed him before he could reveal what he'd found. But what had he found? What connection bound together these seemingly disparate deaths? The answer came to Miss Marple as she was preparing for bed that night. She sat bolt upright, her heart racing, as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Of course, she whispered to herself, that's what this is about. Not revenge, not madness, money. It's always been about money. And if she was right, she knew who the killer was. But proving it would require care, cunning, and considerable courage. Because a killer who had already murdered at least 3 people would not hesitate to kill again. If they felt threatened, Miss Marple would need to be very, very careful indeed. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with a persistent drizzle that matched Miss Marple's somber mood. She had spent much of the night refining her theory, checking it against the known facts, searching for weaknesses in her reasoning. By dawn, she was certain. The pattern was clear, the motive established, the identity of the killer beyond reasonable doubt, but certainty and proof were different things. She needed evidence that would convince Inspector Slack, evidence that would hold up in court, and she needed to obtain that evidence without putting herself or anyone else in further danger. She also needed to understand one final piece of the puzzle. The role of Mrs. Shepherd. Was the cook a willing accomplice, or had she been an unwitting pawn? And where was she now? After breakfast, Miss Marple invited several key individuals to tea at her cottage that afternoon. Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, Raymond West, and most importantly, Captain Patterson. She also requested, through official channels, that Inspector Slack attend a tea party. Inspector Slack had said incredulously when contacted, "I don't have time for tea parties, Miss Marple. I'm investigating a murder." "Yes, Inspector, and I believe I can help you solve it. All I ask is 2 hours of your time this afternoon. If, at the end of it, you don't believe you've made progress, You may arrest me for wasting police time." Intrigued despite himself, Inspector Slack agreed to attend. By 4 o'clock, Miss Marple's small sitting room was crowded with guests. Cherry had prepared an impressive spread of sandwiches and cakes. Though Miss Marple suspected few would have much appetite once she revealed what she had to say. "Thank you all for coming," she began, once everyone was settled with tea. "I know this seems an odd gathering, particularly given the tragic circumstances of the past week. But I believe I understand what has been happening, and I thought it best to explain my conclusions in the presence of witnesses." Inspector Slack shifted impatiently. "Get on with it then, Miss Marple. Who poisoned the dinner party, and who killed Geoffrey Lloyd?" "The same person, Inspector. Someone who has been killing people for at least 2 years, making each death appear natural or accidental, all in pursuit of a very specific goal, financial gain." She had everyone's attention now. Captain Patterson's face had gone pale, and his hand trembled slightly as he set down his teacup. "Let me begin," Miss Marple continued, "with the death of Mrs. Sarah Hamilton's son, Cyril, 2 years ago. He drowned while supposedly under the supervision of his governess, Miss Vera Claythorne. The death was ruled accidental, but Mrs. Hamilton blamed Miss Claythorne and launched a campaign to destroy her professionally. What does this have to do with the poisoning?" Inspector Slack demanded. "Patience, Inspector. Shortly after the drowning, Miss Claythorne received assistance from an anonymous benefactor, someone who promised to handle Mrs. Hamilton, to make her stop her campaign of harassment. Miss Claythorne paid this person for their services, though she never learned their identity. And did this person succeed? Oh yes. Mrs. Hamilton was visited by someone claiming to represent a solicitor's firm. She was threatened with legal action if she continued her harassment. She stopped immediately. So Miss Claythorne was helped by this anonymous person. How is that relevant to murder? Because this person specializes in solving problems for wealthy people, problems that often involve making other people disappear or die. They're what one might call a professional facilitator of crimes, and they keep careful records of their clients, which gives them considerable power. Miss Marple paused to let this sink in. Now, let us consider Lady Beatrice Tressilian, who died in July after a brief illness. Lady Tressilian was Mrs. Hamilton's mother. She was also a very wealthy woman. After her daughter's son died, she revised her will, cutting out her daughter and leaving her considerable fortune to various charities. How do you know that? Captain Patterson asked sharply. I don't know it for certain, Captain, but I strongly suspect it. Lady Tressilian blamed her daughter for the boy's death, felt that Sarah Hamilton had been negligent in hiring a supposedly unsuitable governess. The estrangement would have been complete. Dr. Haydock frowned. But Lady Tressilian died of natural causes, surely. There was no inquest. No inquest, because everyone assumed an elderly woman had died of natural causes. But she had a cook, didn't she? A cook who left her service shortly after Lady Tressilian's death and took a position here in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Shepherd, Mrs. Bantry breathed. You're saying she poisoned Lady Tressilian? I'm saying she may have, wittingly or unwittingly. But the more interesting question is, who benefited from Lady Tressilian's death? Her daughter, presumably. But you said she'd been cut out of the will. Ah, but what if the will was changed back? What if, shortly before Lady Tressilian died, she was convinced to restore her daughter as her heir? Perhaps someone told her that Miss Claythorne had been cleared of all blame, that her daughter had suffered enough. Perhaps someone forged documents to that effect. And then, before Lady Tressilian could discover the deception, she died. Inspector Slack was leaning forward now, his skepticism giving way to interest. You're suggesting someone manipulated Lady Tressilian's will and then killed her. I'm suggesting more than that, Inspector. I'm suggesting someone killed Lady Tressilian, inherited her fortune, and then set about eliminating anyone who might discover the truth. But Mrs. Hamilton is the one who inherited. Are you saying she's the killer? No, Inspector. Mrs. Hamilton died 6 weeks ago. Heart failure, supposedly. But given what we now know, I think we can assume that was murder as well. The room had gone very quiet. Rain pattered against the windows, the only sound besides Miss Marple's gentle, inexorable voice. So let us review. Lady Tressilian dies, leaving her fortune to her daughter. The daughter dies shortly after, leaving everything to whom? Captain Patterson. Captain Patterson had gone white. I don't know. I barely knew Mrs. Hamilton. Why are you looking at me? Because your aunt, Miss Caroline Patterson, died last year, leaving you her cottage and a comfortable sum. And because Miss Caroline Patterson was on the board of governors at Wentworth Academy, where Miss Claythorne taught. And because I believe Miss Patterson discovered something about the drowning in Surrey, something that someone wanted kept secret. That's absurd. My aunt died of a stroke. There was a doctor's certificate and everything. I'm sure there was. But I think if we exhume your aunt's body, we'll find traces of poison. The same poison used at Gossington Hall and the same poison that killed Mr. Lloyd. Captain Patterson half rose from his chair. This is slander. I won't listen to another word. Sit down, Captain, Inspector Slack said, his voice hard. I think you'd better hear Miss Marple out. Miss Marple continued, as though there had been no interruption. Someone has been killing people and inheriting their money, or helping others do so in exchange for payment. Someone who has access to poison, who can forge documents, who can manipulate people into changing their wills. Someone who is patient, clever, and utterly ruthless. And you think that someone is Captain Patterson? Dr. Haydock asked. No, Miss Marple said softly. I think Captain Patterson is another victim. Or rather, he was meant to be. You see, the dinner party at Gossington Hall wasn't primarily meant to kill Miss Claythorne. It was meant to kill Captain Patterson. Captain Patterson stared at her. Kill me, but why? Because you inherited from your aunt, and someone wanted that inheritance. Someone who had killed your aunt specifically so that you would inherit, and then planned to kill you so that they could inherit from you. Someone who is, in fact, your heir. But I don't have an heir. I'm unmarried, no children, no immediate heir, perhaps. But you have a cousin, don't you? A second cousin, once removed, whom you barely know. Someone who, if you died without a will, would inherit your aunt's cottage and money. Captain Patterson's face showed dawning horror. Edward Shepherd. But I haven't seen him in years. I didn't even know he was in England. Last I heard, he was in South Africa. And what was your cousin Edward's occupation, Captain? He was, good God, he was a chemist. He worked for a pharmaceutical company. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. Inspector Slack was scribbling furiously in his notebook. Mrs. Shepherd, Miss Marple said. Not a woman at all, but a man in disguise. Edward Shepherd, your cousin, who killed his way through several people to eventually inherit from you. Who orchestrated the dinner party poisoning, planning to make it appear that the mad cook had poisoned everyone before fleeing. In the confusion, no one would notice, that one guessed you, Captain, had perhaps received a larger dose than the others. You would die, as would several others, and eventually the cook would be caught or killed, the perfect scapegoat. But I didn't die. None of us did. No, because Mrs. Bantry noticed the bitter taste, and Dr. Haydock acted quickly. So Edward Shepherd, your cousin, who had spent 3 weeks in disguise as a cook, waiting for the perfect opportunity, had to disappear without completing his crime. He left behind a newspaper as a red herring, hoping we would focus on Miss Claythorne instead of you. But then why kill Mr. Lloyd? Raymond West asked, his voice raw, because Mr. Lloyd was investigating the deaths. He recognized something, perhaps Edward Shepherd himself. Perhaps some detail about Lady Tressilian or Mrs. Hamilton. He was gathering evidence, writing to solicitors and archives. He was close to exposing the truth. So Edward Shepherd killed him and forged a confession note, trying to close the investigation before the truth came out. Inspector Slack stood abruptly. If this is true, where is Edward Shepherd now? I suspect, Miss Marple said, that he's still in St. Mary Mead, waiting for another opportunity to kill Captain Patterson. He's come too far, killed too many people, to give up now. Then we need to set a trap, Inspector Slack said grimly, with Captain Patterson as bait. Captain Patterson looked as though he might faint, but he nodded. If it will catch the man who murdered my aunt, I'll do it. Miss Marple had one final card to play. There's something else, Inspector. Edward Shepherd couldn't have done all of this alone. He had helped someone who could forge documents, who could manipulate wills, who had contacts in legal firms and could create false identities. I believe there's an accomplice, someone we haven't yet identified. Do you know who? I have a suspicion, but I'd rather not say until I'm certain. For now, let us focus on capturing Edward Shepherd. Once we have him, I believe the accomplice will reveal themselves. The trap was set for the following evening. Captain Patterson would return to his cottage, apparently alone and unprotected. In reality, Inspector Slack and several constables would be hidden throughout the building. If Edward Shepherd made an attempt on his cousin's life, he would be caught in the act. Miss Marple, despite Inspector Slack's objections, insisted on being present as well. I may recognize something you miss, Inspector. And besides, this man is extraordinarily dangerous. You'll need every advantage. As the gathering broke up, Miss Marple caught Dr. Haydock's eye. He lingered after the others had left. Miss Marple, about this accomplice you mentioned. Yes, Doctor. You suspect someone specific, don't you? Someone close to the investigation. Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. I suspect someone who would have had the medical knowledge to help Edward Shepherd make murders appear to be natural deaths. Someone who could have obtained poison easily. Someone who was at the dinner party and who survived, unlike poor Mr. Lloyd. Dr. Haydock's face paled. You don't mean, Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting that I, not you, Doctor. But someone in the medical profession, certainly. Someone with the knowledge and the opportunity. Someone who may have been treating both Lady Tressilian and Captain Patterson's aunt before they died. She left him with that thought, returning to her cottage to prepare for the long night ahead. If her theory was correct, Edward Shepherd would attempt to kill his cousin before dawn, and Miss Marple intended to ensure that this time he would not escape justice. The night was bitterly cold as Miss Marple made her way to Captain Patterson's cottage. Inspector Slack had positioned his men carefully. 2 constables in the garden, 2 more in the house itself, hidden in the spare bedroom and the scullery. The captain would be in his study, apparently absorbed in reading. Actually terrified and armed with a pistol, Miss Marple had been given a position in the morning room, from which she could observe the study door. Inspector Slack had been reluctant to allow her presence, but she had been insistent. "The man we're dealing with is extraordinarily clever, Inspector. He spent months planning these murders, assuming different identities, manipulating people's trust. If anything seems even slightly wrong, he won't proceed. You need someone who understands human behavior, who can recognize when things are not quite as they should be. And you think you're that person." "I know I am, Inspector. I've been observing human nature for 70 years. I know when people are acting according to character and when they're not." Now, as midnight approached, Miss Marple sat in darkness. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light from the study where Captain Patterson pretended to read. The cottage was silent, except for the At 12:30, Miss Marple heard it, the faint sound of a window being opened in the kitchen. She tensed, her hand moving to the small bell she had been given to alert the constables if needed. But she didn't ring it yet. She wanted to see Edward Shepherd with her own eyes, to confirm her theory before the police descended. A shadow moved in the hallway. A figure, dressed in dark clothes, face obscured, moved with silent precision toward the study. They carried something, a cloth, perhaps, or a syringe. Miss Marple couldn't tell in the darkness. The figure reached the study door. Captain Patterson looked up from his book, his face showing calculated surprise rather than genuine shock. "Who?" he began, playing his part. But Miss Marple, watching carefully, saw something that made her ring the bell immediately, urgently, repeatedly, because the figure wasn't entering the study to attack Captain Patterson. The figure was removing something from their pocket, aiming it directly at where Miss Marple sat. "I'm afraid you're too clever for your own good, Miss Marple," said a woman's voice. The lights blazed on as constables rushed in from every direction. Inspector Slack appeared in the doorway, his own pistol drawn, and standing in the hallway, weapon in hand, was Miss Vera Claythorne. "Drop the gun," Inspector Slack shouted. For a moment, Miss Claythorne seemed to consider her options. Then, with a gesture of resignation, she placed the pistol on the hall table and raised her hands. "I thought I'd been so careful," she said calmly. "But of course, Miss Marple, you saw through it, didn't you? You realized that I was never the intended victim. I was the killer all along." Inspector Slack moved forward cautiously to secure the weapon. "Vera Claythorne, I'm arresting you for the murder of Jeffrey Lloyd, and for the attempted murders of save your breath, Inspector. If Miss Marple has pieced it together, you might as well hear the whole story, though I suspect she'll tell it better than I could." They moved to Captain Patterson's study, Miss Claythorne now handcuffed and seated between two constables. Her composure was remarkable. She might have been attending a social function rather than facing arrest for multiple murders. "You lied to me," Miss Marple said quietly. "Your entire story was a fabrication designed to make yourself appear to be a victim rather than a perpetrator. Not entirely fabricated. The drowning happened, more or less as I described, though with some significant differences, such as—" Miss Claythorne's face hardened. "Such as the fact that the boy didn't drown accidentally. I took him swimming deliberately, knowing the currents were dangerous. I wanted him dead." The room recoiled at this cold admission. Even Inspector Slack, who had seen considerable evil in his career, looked shocked. "Why?" Captain Patterson whispered. "He was a child. What could possibly justify money, Captain? It's always about money, isn't it? The Hamiltons were wealthy, but their fortune was tied up in trust funds and entails. The only way to access it was through the children. Mrs. Hamilton had promised me a generous settlement if I helped her simplify her financial situation. She hired you to kill her own son. Dr. Haydock, who had arrived with Inspector Slack, was aghast. Not hired, exactly. We were partners. Sarah Hamilton was deeply in debt from gambling. She needed money desperately. Her son's trust fund would come to her if he died before reaching majority. So we arranged the accident, but the inquest cleared you. Of course it did. We planned it carefully. The nanny was bribed to claim she'd been given permission to leave. Mrs. Hamilton herself testified that I'd been devoted to the children, that the drowning was a tragic accident. Who would suspect a grieving mother of complicity in her own child's murder? Miss Marple's voice was steady, but her eyes were cold. And then you blackmailed Mrs. Hamilton. Naturally. She thought she'd disposed of a useful tool, paid me off with a modest sum and a decent reference. She didn't realize I'd kept evidence letters she'd written. The handkerchief she'd used to signal me when the coast was clear. Other small details that would prove her guilt if examined properly. So when Lady Tressilian cut her daughter out of her will, you saw an opportunity. I'd already established myself as someone who could solve problems discreetly. I helped Mrs. Hamilton convince her mother to restore her as heir, forged a few documents showing that I'd been exonerated of all blame in the drowning, that the family bore no ill will. Lady Tressilian was elderly and sentimental. She wanted to believe her daughter deserved forgiveness. And then you poisoned Lady Tressilian with Sarah Hamilton's full knowledge and consent. I obtained a position in Lady Tressilian's household under a false identity. Mrs. Shepherd was one of several personas I'd developed. I administered arsenic gradually, in small doses, so it appeared to be natural decline followed by organ failure. No one suspected. But you didn't stop there, Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Hamilton inherited her mother's considerable fortune. And then she became inconvenient. She was weak, guilt-ridden. She started talking about confessing, about making amends. I couldn't allow that. So I killed her as well, making it appear to be heart failure brought on by the stress of her mother's death. And I inherited, as her dear friend and confidant named in a will I'd helped her draft. How much? Inspector Slack asked. £300,000. More than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But I'd made a mistake. Miss Patterson, Miss Marple said. Captain Patterson's aunt. She was on the board of governors at Wentworth Academy. She'd been investigating the drowning, hadn't she? She suspected that it wasn't an accident. She'd found a witnesser fisherman who'd seen me with the boy that day, who remembered that I'd seemed to be encouraging him to swim out farther rather than calling him back. She'd written to Mrs. Hamilton, demanding answers, so I had to silence her as well, by poisoning her and making it appear to be a stroke. It was really quite simple by that point. I'd perfected the technique. Small doses of arsenic can mimic various ailments, and I'd learned to forge medical documents, death certificates. I had contacts in the medical profession who could be bribed or deceived. And then you came to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple said. Adopted the identity of Miss Claythorne, the new schoolmistress. You were planning something here, weren't you? I'd discovered that Captain Patterson was Miss Patterson's heir, and that he had a cousin, Edward Shepherd, who would inherit from him. I thought about killing the captain and then killing his cousin, inheriting as Edward Shepherd's nearest relation. But that was too complicated, too many identities to maintain. So you decided to kill multiple people at once, making it appear that a mad cook had poisoned them all. I bribed the real Mrs. Shepherd, Lady Tressilian's former cook, to leave suddenly, making it appear she'd fled from guilt. Then I assumed her identity temporarily, got hired by Mrs. Bantry, and planned the dinner party poisoning. The idea was to poison everyone, including Captain Patterson specifically, so that his death would appear to be random rather than targeted. But we survived. Yes, that fool Mrs. Bantry noticed the taste too quickly, and Dr. Haydock acted too fast. You all survived, and I had to abandon the plan and disappear as Mrs. Shepherd. And then Geoffrey Lloyd started investigating. Miss Claythorne's face darkened. He recognized me, not as Miss Claythorne, but as someone he'd seen years ago at a trial. I'd testified as a character witness for someone accused of fraud, a small case, long forgotten by most people. But Lloyd had been covering the trial for a magazine. He remembered my face, and he started asking questions, writing letters, digging into my background. So, you killed him. I had no choice. He'd have exposed everything. I visited him at the Blue Boar, brought him coffee laced with arsenic, forced him at gunpoint to write that ridiculous confession note. Then I watched him die and left his room as though I'd simply been making a social call. The room was silent, absorbing the enormity of these admissions. Finally, Captain Patterson spoke, his voice shaking. But why come after Miss Marple tonight? She'd already figured it out. Killing her wouldn't have helped you escape. Miss Claythorne looked at Miss Marple with something like respect, because she was the only one who truly understood. The police still thought Mrs. Shepherd was a real person, that I was a victim. If I could eliminate Miss Marple before she explained her theory fully, I might still have escaped. I could have claimed she'd been killed by Mrs. Shepherd, that the mad cook had returned to silence the one person who'd seen through her disguise. But I did explain my theory, Miss Marple said, this afternoon to several witnesses. Even if you'd killed me, Inspector Slack would have known the truth. Yes, I realized that too late. I'd been so focused on you, on your investigation, that I didn't consider you might have already shared your conclusions. She smiled bitterly. I underestimated you, Miss Marple. A mistake I won't make again. Inspector Slack stood. Vera Claythorne, you will be charged with the murders of Cyril Hamilton, Lady Beatrice Tressilian, Mrs. Sarah Hamilton, Miss Caroline Patterson, and Mr. Geoffrey Lloyd. You will also be charged with the attempted murders of 8 people at Gossington Hall. Do you have anything else to say? Only that I regret nothing except being caught. They were all in my way, all obstacles to what I deserved. I'm not sorry they're dead. I'm only sorry I won't be able to spend the money I killed for. As she was led away, Miss Marple felt a great weariness settle over her. She had solved the case, identified the killer, prevented further deaths. But the cost had been terrible. 5 people dead, 8 nearly killed, and the revelation of evil so calculated and cold that it chilled her to her core. How did you know it was her? Dr. Haydock asked quietly after Miss Claythorne had been taken away. When did you realize? Several small things, Miss Marple replied. The story she told me about being helped by an anonymous benefactorate was too convenient, too perfectly designed to make her appear innocent. The way she was nervous at the dinner party before anyone was poisoned, as though she were anxious about something going wrong with her plan. The fact that she seemed to know more about the other guests than a newcomer to the village should have known. But those are just suspicions. What made you certain? The newspaper advertisement. Claythorne. The matter in Surrey is concluded. I realized it wasn't a message to Miss Claythorne. It was from Miss Claythorne. She was advertising her services as someone who could solve problems discreetly. PM at the end stood for Problem Manager or some such coded reference. She was running a criminal enterprise, helping wealthy people commit crimes in exchange for payment or a share of the proceeds. Good God, Captain Patterson breathed. And I invited that woman into my home, chatted with her at village functions, never suspecting. How could you suspect? She was extraordinarily clever, extraordinarily patient. If Geoffrey Lloyd hadn't recognized her, she might have gotten away with it all. 3 weeks after Vera Claythorne's arrest, St. Mary Mead had begun to return to something approximating normalcy. The story of the multiple murders had, inevitably, attracted considerable attention from the newspapers, but the worst of the sensation-seeking had passed. The village was left to pick up the pieces and try to understand how such evil had walked among them. Undetected, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, knitting as always, while Mrs. Bantry recounted the latest gossip over tea. They found the real Mrs. Shepherd, Mrs. Bantry reported, living in Brighton under an assumed name. Apparently, Miss Claythorne paid her £500 to disappear suddenly and gave her references to use for a new position. Poor woman had no idea she was being set up to take the blame for multiple murders. I'm glad she's been found, Miss Marple said. It must have been terrifying for her, realizing she was wanted for crimes she didn't commit. And they've exhumed Captain Patterson's aunt and Lady Tressilian. Both showed traces of arsenic poisoning, just as you predicted. The evidence is overwhelming. Miss Claythorne will hang, there's no question of it. Miss Marple said nothing. She took no pleasure in anyone's death, even when they deserved it. Raymond tells me you've been very quiet since it all ended, Mrs. Bantry continued gently. Are you quite all right, Jane? I'm well enough, Dolly, just tired. It's exhausting, discovering such evil in the world, such calculated cruelty. But you stopped her. You saved Captain Patterson's life, and probably others as well. She wouldn't have stopped killing, would she? No. She'd have continued until she was caught, or until she had enough money to disappear entirely. She was clever, ruthless, and completely without conscience. The worst kind of criminal. Dr. Haydock arrived shortly after, bringing news of his patient's recoveries. Everyone from the dinner party has made a full recovery, I'm pleased to report. No lasting effects from the arsenic, thanks to quick treatment. That's wonderful news, Dr. Though, I must say, Miss Marple, you gave us all quite a fright when Miss Claythorne pulled that gun. If you hadn't rung the bell when you did. But I did ring it, and Inspector Slack's men responded admirably. All's well that ends well, as they say. After the doctor had departed, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts. The case was closed, justice would be served, and life would continue. But she found herself thinking about the victims, the innocent child, drowned by his governess and his own mother. The elderly lady, Tressilian, poisoned by someone she'd trusted. Mrs. Hamilton, killed by her accomplice. Miss Patterson, murdered for asking too many questions. Geoffrey Lloyd, killed for being too clever. And she thought about Vera Claythorne, who had chosen evil so deliberately, who had killed without remorse, who had seen other people merely as obstacles or opportunities. What made a person like that? What combination of nature and circumstance produced such a monster? Miss Marple had no answers. She had learned, over many years, that evil existed in the world. that people were capable of terrible things when they convinced themselves that what they wanted was more important than others' lives. That greed, properly cultivated, could overcome all moral considerations. But she had also learned that good existed as well, that people like Dr. Haydock would risk their own lives to save others, that people like Captain Patterson would serve as bait to catch a killer, that communities would come together in crisis, supporting and protecting one another. St. Mary Mead had been shaken by these murders, but it would endure. The village had seen evil and had not been destroyed by it. Life would continue, with all its ordinary joys and sorrows, its minor dramas and small triumphs, and Miss Marple would continue as well, observing human nature with her keen, compassionate eye, knitting her patterns, tending her garden, and when necessary ensuring that justice was served. That evening, as the sun set over the village, Miss Marple sat in her garden, watching the roses nod in the gentle breeze. The world was full of mysteries, she reflected, some dark and some light. Her job was to illuminate the dark ones, to bring truth into the light, to ensure that evil did not triumph over good. It was a heavy responsibility, but one she bore willingly, for someone had to stand against the darkness. Someone had to speak for the victims who could no longer speak for themselves. Someone had to ensure that the Vera Claythorns of the world did not prosper from their crimes. And in St. Mary Mead, that someone was Miss Jane Marple. As darkness fell, she gathered her knitting and went inside, closing the door on another day, another case, another victory for justice over evil. Tomorrow would bring new puzzles, new observations, new opportunities to understand the endlessly fascinating, endlessly troubling nature of humanity. But tonight, she would rest, content in the knowledge that she had done her duty. The village was safe. The killer had been caught. And in a world that often seemed to reward the wicked and punish the good, at least this once, justice had prevailed. Miss Marple slept soundly that night, her conscience clear, her mind at peace. And in the morning, she would rise and continue her life's work, watching, listening, understanding, and when necessary acting to ensure that evil did not go unpunished, and that the innocent were protected. For that, after all, was what Miss Marple did.